Welcome back from our short break, everyone. Last lesson we talked about proteins and dairy. We have some more awesome lessons up our sleeve for today's show.
Yes, we learned why it's important to have proteins and dairy in our diet and how protein can come from many sources other than meat. For example, legumes.
Ah yes, legumes. My favorite. You're probably wondering, hey, isn't a legume a plant? And yes, it is. Plants are very fascinating. They provide us with many of the foods we eat, which in return help us grow.
All right. That's it for last lesson's recap. Hey, Wonder Child, how are you feeling today? Since we're on the topic of plants, is there anything you were wondering about them?
Hey, that was a little cheesy. Weren't we done with the dairy lesson? But I'm doing well. During our little break, I took a little stroll outside and paused to smell all the pretty flowers, and then boom! So many questions popped into mind.
Oh wow, questions like what?
So obviously, I know what a plant is, and that a plant comes from a seed, but like, what do we call that? Sprouting? Is there a certain word for that process?
Phew, beats me. Luckily we have our special guest here today to answer all your questions, Wanderer. Ladies and gents, here with us today we have Phil the Plant Doctor coming to us live about, cut the camera. You had one job. Anyway, hello beautiful creatures. As our host was trying to say, today I'll be talking about germination and pollination and answering all your questions for me. Wanderer?
Oh my, those are pretty big words. You mind explaining what those mean?
Absolutely. So let's take some baby steps, starting off first with germination. You know what, Wanderer? Germination is the answer to your question from earlier. It's when a wee, cute little adorable, extraordinary...
You're getting a little carried away, Phil.
My apologies. Germination is when a seed sprouts into you guessed it, a plant.
I knew it!
But did you really? I mean, after all, you did ask that question earlier. Please make that make sense.
You know what?
Okay, and back to me. Let's do experiments to get my point across for germination, and then we can mosey on over to what pollination is. But first, vocab. So, a seed coat is what we call that little outer covering of the seed that keeps the embryo inside nice and safe. Now, the first leaves that actually sprout are called cotyledons, which eventually turn into the plant's true leaves through time.
Okay, I see. Interesting.
Yep, very. Now, on to the fun part. Experiments. Come, follow me. Here, we have a Ziploc bag, a marker, some beans, a damp paper towel, and some tape. What we're going to do is write today's date on the bag. Let's see here. Just like that. Looks good. Then, what we're going to do is we're going to take our paper towel and our seed, wrap it up nice and neat, put it in the bag, like so, seal it up nice and tight. There we go. Now I'm going to take my tape, and we're going to tape it right to the window.
Why are we taping it to the window?
Glad you asked. We're taping our experiments to the window, not because it needs light, which of course, is still very important, but because the seed needs the warmth for it to sprout, and then needs the light to continue growing. Now the warmth is very important because in order for the seed to sprout, it needs to be the right temperature, moist, and have oxygen. Now typically we wait 3 to 5 days because that's when seeds generally begin germinating. And then afterwards, what we'll do is we'll put the sprouted seeds into some soil, and then they'll start growing and growing their true leaves. Now remember, these leaves must stay above the soil to continue growing. And there you have it, folks. Germination. Now you try it.
Wow, what a process. Thank you so much, Phil. So, a quick review of today's germination lesson. What is germination? Now what about the conditions? What does the seed need in order to sprout? And lastly, how long should it take for it to germinate?
awesome review questions. Now, what about pollination? Glad you brought that up. Now, pollen is a powder that sticks to insects and fertilizes plants, whereas pollination is when pollen moves from the male plant to the female plant.
So does anything need to be done to the plant so it can produce seeds and fruits?
Yes, plants need to be fertilized so it can maintain that healthy cycle of producing seeds and fruits, and eventually the next generation of plants will grow. However, if plants don't get pollinated, it disrupts that cycle and we don't get any food to eat. That's why we need pollinators.
Oh, what are pollinators, Phil?
Pollinators are animals that carry pollen from one plant to another. Think of a bee for an example. Oh, how I love bees. What happens is a bee will suck on the nectar from one flower and the pollen from the flower sticks onto the bee. And so when that little guy decides to suck on nectar from another flower, it transfers the pollen from the last flower onto the new one because of all that pollen stuck on him. On another note, there's also self-pollination, where sometimes a plant can pollinate itself because of having both male and female parts and the wind, where pollen is carried by the wind straight to another plant.
Wow, I'm starting to love bees too. I didn't know they played such an important role. And speaking of bees, is there anything we can do to take care of them?
I'm glad you asked, Wanderer. Bees help us in many ways, so in return, we should help them too. Don't kill bees or other bugs. They're nature's friends, and our friends too. Never use pesticides and insecticides because those harm our bee friends. And lastly, plant lots more pollinator plants, like lots of flowers.
That's awesome. Is there any way you can show us exactly how those bees go from one plant to another, pollinating?
So, here with me, I have a bee. Look at him, he's a cool little guy, just buzzing around. And two different colored flowers here, represented by these bowls. So let's say the bee decides to land on this orange bowl. Here we go. He's just rubbing all in there, getting pollen all over him. And then he decides to buzz on over to the next bowl. And then, what do you know? He spreads that pollen to the next flower. But you notice that some of the pollen that was on his body fell off. And that's how pollination works.
Nice, I totally get it now. Well, it seems like we are nearing the end of our show. Thank you for your time, Phil.
You are very welcome. And thanks for having me. Or should I say us?
And that, folks, was Phil the Plant Doctor. Now I'm handing the mic over to the host to wrap up today's segment with our review questions.
Thank you, Wonder Child. I hope you all enjoyed today's Germination Pollination lesson. Got it right that time. But before we let you go, we have questions for you. Gal, back to you.
Great. So tell me, what is pollen? Next, name one way that plants can get pollinated. Why are petals of a flower so important? And lastly, why are pollinators so important to humans and how can we help the bees?
Alrighty, that's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in for the ShreveCorps Morning Show. Out! Just kidding. You were supposed to do that. I stole your line.
You definitely did.